this.
Dottie the Norfolk Terrier will be too adorable and too much of a distraction. So I'll put her outside. So I've put up the Summer Series 60 series from the IIM of webinars. We might as well make a start. Just a couple of things. This is the first seminar in the 2020 series. It's an in-depth analysis of the survey that Ed has been running, my co-host, for more than 10 years, and myself for 2 years helping Ed with the survey. Just at this point, I'm going to cut across to the actual website where you can find the surveys. I don't know whether people are aware that the survey is available from this particular web link up here. Hopefully you're seeing this on screen. And there's the current image that Ed selected for the current survey. And
it seemed an appropriate image. We're running out of pictures of people with binoculars.
Last year's was where are we going, hence the binoculars, and previous year. So we've had a common theme, but they're all available for download if you wish, and just by clicking on the download the PDF. Back to the presentation. So the agenda is, first of all, please could you use the chat box to ask any questions of the panelists from the start of this presentation. If you've got a question now, please put it on. A little bit of housekeeping, well, we've just done it.
Mm-hmm.
The agenda really is about 30 minutes of presentation on selected aspects of the 2020 IIM survey and trends that we've seen over the last several years, and followed by a Q&A. One proviso we have is that we'll be able to answer some simple IR35 questions, I'm sure, but our expert, Tony Evans, who unfortunately is unable to be with us on the seminar, if you do have any questions of Tony, please put them in the chat box. We will make sure he gets them, but please leave your email address and we shall download the chat text at the end of the session.
Yes, we'll try and give it a go, though.
We'll give it a go. Today's speakers, Ed and myself. Ed, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, briefly, I've been an interim for 13 years. That's a scary thing to say. I've been an interim for longer than I was, longer than any permanent job I ever had, which is kind of weird. And I've been involved in the IIM for about 11 years, 12 years. Since the last economic downturn, when it became clear that in an economic downturn, as an interim, you have to get good or not eat. So that's why I first joined up with the IIM, and I've been supporting the survey for about 11 years. So that's me. Simon?
Well, I've been an interim for about getting on for 25 years here and in Australia, so you can probably hear a bit of an accent. I've been a member of the IIM for 15 years, and I'm currently helping Ed on the annual survey, 2 years over the last 11. And I'm an interim finance director, moving in different directions at the moment, but that's another story. But for the moment, let's move on. So the IIM surveys are 2010 to 2020, that's 11 surveys. Ed, do you want to go into a little bit more background on some of these?
Yeah, 2010 just was a bit of a cunning wheeze to see if anybody would fill it in. Around 500 or 600 people did. Since then, it's been many, many thousands of people, and it has become an annual ritual where people get peppered and badgered to fill the thing in again. So I'm certainly appreciative of all the many thousands of hours that have been employed in filling it in. The key part, of course, of the survey is that it's a way to get non-commercially tainted data, or data that essentially people aren't having to pay through a paywall to get to, for basic information about the market. And that basic information is something I feel very strongly about as a service to the interim community. and it's been 11 years. So there you go. A few spreadsheets have died in the service of this. Simon?
So, so the aim of what we're going to do now is to provide a flavour of the insights and trends focusing on interim criteria. What's important to interims, day rates, sector preferences, and the most important thing, I think, is the fundamental importance of relationships. That's people relationships, business relationships, whether it be fellow interims, clients, ISPs, regulators, whatever. So of fundamental importance, and we'll draw this out in this series as it goes through. So the very first question, if people remember back to filling in the survey, is that first question number one, what's your age? Your age range, so that we can plot this. And we've got 7 years here visible on screen. I was going to go back a little bit further, but you can see that some trends here. The trend line is actually that it's fairly flat.
It's pretty consistent, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
The average age has varied by a smidgen, hardly anything.
We've got a couple of areas, age ranges that have dipped a little bit, or one, but in particular, that's the 40 to 49, corresponding uptake with the 60 to 69. And we've got the 50 to 59, which is the peak, reaching more than 50% of the respondents, slightly on that rise, but generally it's pretty flat from year to year. I guess.
If anything, you might say that there's a few more older interims than there used to be, and a few more younger interims than there used to be. So it's broadened a little.
Yeah. The next one is roles profile. This is quite interesting as well. The major uptrend we can see here is really on the consultants moving upwards. It's the second from the bottom. And also the CEO, MD, GM roles, with a bit of a spike or a flatness here, there, and everywhere. But generally, it's fairly consistent. We've got 7 years worth of data on the screen again. And the one that tends to be diving a little bit is the managers and the heads of departments. Any comment, Ed?
No, I'm actually looking for a slightly different thing while you're doing this, and I'll come back with a thought on gap assignments.
Okay.
Very shortly.
Rate ranges is what everybody's interested in. 4 years ago, we had a rejigging of the survey to extend the rate ranges because 800 plus was quite a chunk. So we split it out, and we've also, in the last couple of years, defined an interim as being a day rate of more than 500 for the purposes of the survey. We do get people still filling it in less than 500, but as you can see, if we look at the 2020, there's generally a trend there around 600 to 700, 800, but fairly consistent again across this range. Bearing in mind that across the 3 years, people themselves move in age range, therefore the experience also moves as well, and perhaps some of the rates go up as well. Add any comment?
I think the comment I'd want to make, and this is about the point at which an interim is an interesting one. We've used £500 as if you like, a useful cutoff, but I think it's absolutely true that public sector, and we'll come on to this later, public sector rates have been coming down for both political pressure and now with COVID, I suspect we'll see economic pressure. And therefore, what we would consider to be a £500 plus interim may get less money simply by virtue of the circumstance, but they are still operating as a proper business in their own right interim manager. for that reason, I think there are still plenty of interims who did get less than 500 this year for assignments who absolutely deserve to be considered interim managers. Simon?
Yes, I'm just going to stop there and just see if there's any more people to admit.
Cool.
I think we're fine. And you're keeping tabs of the chat?
I'm keeping tabs on the chat.
Great. I'll go back into the presentation. So moving on, we have, oops, I think I've gone one too far. There we go. This is the sector preference.
Yes. Essentially, with the public sector coming under the more intense remit of IR35 regulations fairly recently, we've seen the proportion of the interim market decline in terms of public sector versus private. So did the IR35 regulatory changes affect public sector? We think they did. Certainly we're seeing a reduction of the number of interims who consider themselves interims in the public sector space. And I'd certainly welcome any comment from anybody operating in the public sector today in the chat, if you have a view on whether you too have seen the proportion of interims be under pressure. So we're seeing that gap increase. Simon?
So that's the sector preferences. Then we get the average sector day rates.
Yes, and in terms of day rates, since the last economic downturn, we've seen more or less a gentle increase in rates. Although that rate masks the fact that the public sector has diverged fairly significantly from the private sector, which was only a handful of percentage points apart 10 years ago. Now there is a good 20% difference, and that's something we've seen over the last 11 years.
Anything in the chat so far that needs to be commented on? We're just about to move on to the relationships part of the presentation.
I have a question coming in from Sharon. Do we think we'll expect to see a softening on rates post-COVID? What I think will be really interesting, and put it like this, we need two sticks to measure. We've got the 2011 survey measured in May this year, and it's going to need the 2021 survey to see exactly what happens thereafter. I think there's two pressures. One is for softening, and one is bizarrely for firming. With the IR35 regulatory changes pushing some interims out of the market, because they will be working in areas where clients will say, I want this person within IR35. I could actually see a reduction in the number of casual interim managers, and it's perfectly possible that will mean that there will be that the number of quality interim managers sought for assignments will still be hard to come by. So I'm not convinced that the interim market will be awash with quality interims. What do you reckon, Simon?
I think I'll pass on that.
Pass on that. I think we'll see, but I could see a good number of interims falling out of the interim community. I think interim management could become a smaller thing because of the IR35 regulatory changes. So people who are at the top of their game should be able to retain the day rates they're used to, even after COVID. They just may have to wait a little longer and look a little longer for the assignments.
Actually, there was feedback from the COVID section on the surveys.
I think so.
People had fallen out of the interim market to go permanent.
And the same thing happened we saw this with the survey in 2010, which also captured data on 2009. There was a rate depression, but in the scheme of things, it was actually quite temporary. So I would hope the same thing, if it happens this time, will be the same, that it will be a temporary blip.
Okay. So moving on to relationships. So the question at the top was rather a wordy one. If the placement on assignment placement was via a service provider, we're talking about dominantly service providers from now on, consultant that you already knew, how had the relationship been established? And if we look at the series here across 7 years, dominantly, if we look at the color coding, the largest bar there at the bottom is for a prior assignment, meaning that there's experience of the ISP, possibly the client too, with the interim, and that really was the reason for, again, more work coming in that direction. If we look at the referral, which is the gold sign, referral is about knowing. It's about referring people on you know can do the job. And there's a spattering in there of an event, people meeting at consultants, recruitment consultants, say at networking events, which is the grey. There's a tiny box in there for via the IIM. It's not been one of our priorities recently. It's the blue, which is between the green and the gold. And then some that didn't respond. But overall, if you read these and add these up, there's about 70% there, which is about relationships, of which 40–50% there is roughly about relationships with, I believe, ISPs.
Okay.
Which I think supports the IIM stance that roughly 60% of assignments come through ISPs and 40% come through your own relationships with other interims, with clients, other kinds of referrals.
Simon, may I ask a request?
Yep.
I'm getting questions on the chat about the sector day rate breakdown.
Okay.
I wonder if we could try a little fun experiment.
Sure.
If we went to this year's SurveyMonkey analysis for question 9, is that something you could kindly bring up on screen?
Okay, I shall.
Question 9 is the broad day rate.
Share across to the.
Exactly.
SurveyMonkey, which is
yes, please. That's it. And this is, I have to say, is the joy of having 11 years worth of surveys at the fingertips, because they can be filtered depending on which criteria you want. So shall we go down to question 9, please?
It was 2020 you referred to?
2020, yeah, 2020 for question 9.
It's live, it's getting the information from
It is?
In the States.
There we go.
Question 9 is the next one coming up.
Question 9, here we go. And this, if you like, is the broad day rate swathe from below 500 to, I don't want to tell you. Okay, now we have the ability to filter this. And if Simon, you could kindly open up a filter, please.
This is on custom.
Let's customize, yeah.
Customize.
No, it's over on the left-hand column of the screen where it says filter, plus filter.
Oh yeah, filter.
And we filter by question, and I think the question we're filtering by is the one on sector. So we can filter. So what sector? What's the main question 7? So what's the main sector you work in? So let's see what happens if we make it just private sector. Let's see if that makes a difference.
It's gone and
this is also where we discover how viable this is to do in real time.
Yes, it is. So that's filtered on the private sector.
There's a few more expensive ones in this group, I guess. That's the first thing that leaps out at me.
Yeah.
Should we try again by public sector this time?
No matching responses.
I think that might be because Let's look again at the filter. Is that because there's two filters switched on?
Probably. Delete that one and come back to the public.
Ah, that's better.
There we go.
That's quite the difference, isn't it?
Mark.
So there's a real pressure, and please tell us in the chat if this is bearing out in public sector, a real pressure to not pay interims more than the Prime Minister. Wasn't that the phrase that was used a few years
I
ago?
believe it was. Okay.
So a very clear indication of the difference. Right, I'm going back to the chat.
Okay. Back to
Sector rate range. Has the rate range narrowed or broadened? I think it's broadened because there are certainly more interims getting very, very nice rates. And because of the economic circumstances and COVID, there are also interims taking a lot less money. So I think there is a larger spread. However, the peak remains pretty much where it was, which is around 800 quid as an average.
and it's also the reason why 3 years ago we broadened out the rate ranges to be from 800 plus to include the higher rate ranges so that we could quantify what they were.
I'm just picking up a comment from Nigel to say that Nigel finds it interesting that there's more. I think Nigel's saying there's more opportunities via interim service providers. It's something that we did put a caveat of not concern, a caveat of caution in the survey this year, because we know that interim service providers love to promote the survey because they get rated in it. So because of that, we think there is a slight lead towards interims in the service provider supported community filling the survey in versus interims going straight to clients. So for that reason, if we were just to measure the rates between the ISP interims and the direct interims, we'd see a higher proportion in favor of the ISP interims, simply by virtue of the model of how we're collecting the data.
Yeah.
So I don't think in actuality it's 60-40.
Okay.
And I think there will be interim managers who go direct to clients that simply because we can't get at them, we haven't got them in the data. Maybe there's ways in the future we can get at them.
Okay, thank you for challenging my assumption on that one. It's always welcome. Moving on to the next one, which is, how did you become aware of the opportunity? This is through an ISP, so we're focusing mostly on ISPs from now on. And you can see roughly 60% is from an ISP, by ISP with opportunity. In other words, that was somebody approaching the ISP. Then there were adverts, emails, events, meeting recruiters at an event, networking event, and referrals. So, but I guess that what it's supporting here is the fact that relationships is what counts in the interim industry generally. Yeah.
And particularly with COVID in mind, with more people potentially chasing less assignments, that relationship becomes even more important than it was. There's almost a process whereby it's helpful for the interim to shortcut any assignment search process. If you are relying on your CV sitting in a folder on either a client's desk or a service provider's desk, I think your chances are significantly reduced. If you can jump into the process much closer to the assignment, i.e. already in the mind of the client or already in the mind of the provider consultant, then I think in this tough time, you're getting a much better chance of getting to the piece of work frankly, before the folder of CVs even gets opened.
Indeed.
And I think that's going to be the key to getting assignment work at this time, is to really focus on the relationship with your favorite clients and favorite clients from the past, and your favorite provider consultants and consultants that have got you work in the past.
And this is exactly borne out by the next slide, which
Yeah.
is it's the known person that gets you the work, the connection with the known person.
Yeah,
Not so much
absolutely.
being on a database.
You're something like 7 times more likely to get work off the back of already knowing the consultant who's handling the piece of work than having your CV sitting in the database. And I'll pick up the point that Ralph makes in the chat, that yes, provider firms do have good databases, but in practice, it's about who's already in their head. A provider consultant is going to want to put a candidate to a client that they already know has a good track record of landing the pitch and doing a fine piece of work. Because if they put their assignment candidate up against an assignment candidate from another agency, then they want the reassurance that they're putting in somebody who can land it.
Exactly. And this one.
Tony, if I may, Tony makes a point in the chat that the source is often quite polarized. There are some people who get the bulk of their work through the direct routes with clients, and other interims very much focus on ISPs. Yeah, it's very much personal preference and style.
So this becomes an interesting question then. What's more important to you, the reputation of the firm or credibility of the individual consultant? And we can see that the firm down here is around 10%, the consultant's roughly 35, 40, and others say it's a mixed bag. But really it says it's again about relationships with individual consultants that counts. This was 3 years data. The trend does go further back. So it's, I was only managed to get 3 years at this point in time.
And isn't it funny how when an interim service provider consultant goes dark, you know when they stop talking to anybody, it typically means they've either resigned or in some kind of non-disclosure or
I think it's called
garden leave period before they then pop up again somewhere else.
Which then nicely leads into the next slide, which is, do you approach recruitment consultants who have changed firms? And this surprises me because I'm surprised, yes, it's not higher. It's building,
I agree.
certainly.
I think there's a lot to be said to build on any consultant loyalty or relationship. When they move with them, but also stick around with any consultant relationships at the firm where they've just gone. And for that reason, it's usually quite a good idea to have at least 2 contacts at a provider firm, because if one of them does bail, one of my favorite ever provider consultants changed job and became a masseur, rather curiously. But of course, that then killed the relationship with that service provider firm, because I didn't have a second contact. And I essentially had to start all over again. So
it's so easy around the to be able to follow them on LinkedIn.
Yep.
People after gardening leave, after a period of time, will change their LinkedIn profile. So it's very easy to do. Okay, the last is a separate question about expectations of the next 12 months. This is a question we've only had in for 3 years, so there's 3 years data. But you can see growth is pretty flat. Tougher is by far the clear winner. And it would be interesting to log this over the next 10 years of the survey, just to see how this changes. So this is about expectations for the next 12 months. And on this regard, the IIM is also pulling together a series of quarterly, I believe, market expectations surveys, which ought to be coming out in the next several months. And more about that in the last series of last seminar of this series, which is about the IIM and how it's changing. We'll come back to that later. But the obvious point here to be made is that more than 60% expected to be much tougher because of COVID. It's a moot point really, but it's there, it shows.
And the same thing was clear in the data from the 2010 when we were recovering from the last economic downturn. And we also saw at that time there was a swathe of almost, you call it retirement. There was a group of interims who basically called it a day. And I could see the same thing happening this time, a tranche of interims who say, I've had enough, I'm retiring.
I think that's already
too much like hard work.
The data we've collected in this survey, that there is a tranche that are just retired.
It also suggests there will be less new interims entering the marketplace because we've got COVID, we've got economic pressure, and we've also got additional IR35 regulations
coming in next year.
Could see a reduction of new entrants into the market. The positive here is that should give a little bit of breathing room to the interims who are, quote, doing it properly, you know, outside of IR35, to continue to do so. It might be a little harder work to get the gigs, but still viable.
Yes. So that's the end of the presentation about the 2020 survey. So the 2021, coming in the last webinar of this series will be Tony's presentation on what the IIM is doing. I'm leading on a digital presence project, which is almost like a digital transformation of how the IIM operates. One of the aims on the survey data is to provide members with details online, and I note the comment there, members, because we do want people to join, with detailed online analytic capabilities of individual surveys and trends where available since 2010. And incorporated into that will be the new market surveys that we'll be doing on, I believe, on a quarterly basis. So a member will be able to, for example, analyze fellow interim details, not their names and addresses, etc., but more the age profiles, gender profiles, locations. It's obviously GDPR compliant. And more interestingly, and I think this is quite fascinating, filter ISPs or any other criteria by interim role. For example, turnaround, or and by function, for example, finance, procurement, HR, by assignment type, sector, public, private, benevolent, rate ranges, build days, market predictions, with the aim of enabling members to focus on ISPs of interest and be better informed about the market. So where the digital presence project is bringing in a brand new platform, it'll have data analysis, analytic capabilities, and for members to be able to, through the log on, we're aiming for, to be able to say, okay, I'm a finance guy, I work in this rate range. There's all sorts of criteria you can drill down on that will give you comfort, or ISPs to especially target, as they're rated by fellow interims as being worthy of support. That's the end of that series of this webinar. We're now going to go into the questions. But before
we have two already.
We have two already. I'd just like to remind people of what the other webinars are in the series. Hopefully you're seeing series 1, 2, etc.
Yeah. Series
1 is the one we've just done. What makes a winning ISP? We've got a presentation by Darren Holthurst was voted number 1 ISP of Practicus. We've got our top 3 consultant panels. The top 3 consultants per the analysis that Adam and I did. So we've got Anthony Lewis of Tile Hill, we've got Lawrence Francis of Interim Partners, and Alison Rotondo of Eton Bridge coming in to do a webinar. The dates are on the website. We've got a public sector market with Jessica Mulligan. Focus on some fast rising providers. These are ones that have risen up through the ranks of bronze, gold, bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. We've invited David Weir of Tile Hill and Tracy Rawson of Rawson Downey to do a presentation. We've got a private sector market view. This will be an interesting one. So we've got Steve Deverell of Eton Bridge, Doug Baird of Interim Partners, and James Humphreys of Wilton and Bain. And then the last one I've mentioned several times, which is Tony's going to lead on what the IIM is transforming in the next 12 months to several years. And that, I think, is the extent of the presentation. So we can go over to a Q&A session and catch up on the chat box.
Can I ask, if people have questions or an area of the survey they want to drill into, please stick your question, if you wish, in the chat so that we can start to answer things that are on your mind. Can I address the first one, Simon?
Yes, sure.
I'm kind of banking Colin's question just for a second. Colin's asked about offshoring of roles, but the one I wanted to hit first, if I may, is one from Debbie. And while I'm talking through this question, Simon, would you very kindly open up the survey from 2014 for me on page 20?
Okay.
And Debbie's question is, Debbie started, oh, okay, that's bounced, I've now lost the chat, so let me go back to the chat.
So we go back into 2014.
2014, page 20. Debbie also was an interim at the start of the last recession and is asking about how the perception expectation that the market would be tougher bore out in practice, and asks about assignment numbers. Now, ISPs, of course, will often say, despite the disruptions, aren't they doing great? You know, they're doing loads of work and there's loads of assignments, but that isn't always replicated in how many calls the interims get. So I just thought it would be helpful. Would you mind going into the actual survey itself, Simon, rather than the SurveyMonkey tool? So on the IIM website.
Oh, back there. Okay.
Yes, because there was a bespoke chart that I thought summed it up rather nicely.
So this is how you download them.
Yeah.
Very easy. Click mine.
And to give a context to this, we actually tracked who was on assignment and off assignment, and we actually asked interims to look backwards, all the way back to the year 2000.
Okay.
So at this point, we had 14 years of data.
So where are we going?
Page 20, please. And what this chart does is it basically shows the impact of an economic downturn.
Excuse me while I blip through all the...
And there it is. There it is, number 20, just above. What page are you on?
Page 20.
Could you go up? I think I just saw... Okay. For some reason, I just saw the thing and it's not page 20. Go, there it is. I was looking at the page number at the top of the top page. So it's actually page 21. There you go. I'm giving you tough information.
Yeah.
So you can see there, this is the proportion of interims who said they were on assignment at any one time. And you can see that trough corresponding to the economic downturn. And I think this is measuring in quarters. So essentially the last economic downturn gave interims a good kicking for about 7 quarters. What do you reckon?
Somewhere around that, yeah.
Somewhere around there.
26.
What's going to be interesting this time is how you feel the COVID economic disruption will be different to the last economic downturn, whether you feel it'll be deeper and shorter, or whether it will last as long as the last one did. But as you can see, things did come back. And it wasn't a gentle collapse and a gentle recovery. It was quite a steep collapse and quite a steep recovery.
Well, if you call that a V or a U,
yeah,
I would call it almost like a V, really.
Yeah.
Rather than
any follow up on that, Debbie? So I would expect almost something sharper and tighter, but that's a gut feel. I'd be interested to read if anybody else has a view on this.
I think in economics terms that is really quite tight and sharp. These are quarters, and yeah.
Okay. FG has asked another question, but if I may, there's a question from Colin I'd like to try and address next, which is in the Q&A tab. I don't know if you can see that, Simon. I'll read Colin's question.
Is that on screen?
What's the view on mass offshoring of roles to respond to IR35 reform, e.g. by banks or of IT roles, and the taxation of the same to disincentivize that from happening and keep roles shored within the UK or raise funds for the public purse? I guess the question here is about, do we expect roles to go elsewhere to duck IR35, basically?
My view on that is no. The reason being, I think that senior interims who are interchange management, which is the dominant focus, will still be employed and still be onshore, and they'll also be outside of IR35. It's the juniors in the interim ranks. It's more like the contractors who will find it harder. They may well go offshore, certainly if they're caught by IR35. That's just my personal view, not necessarily the IIM's view.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to agree. I think if you want some serious piece of change worth doing, that's going to be much harder, particularly with the challenges of people flying around the world at the minute. That's going to be harder to offshore.
Indeed.
If you've got a problem in the UK, you still need a physical person in the UK, even if they're at the end of a Zoom.
Other questions?
I'd like to pick up the point here. How would interim managers switch within the private sectors due to the cyclical downturn? Could you say a bit more, FG, on what you mean? I mean, presumably you're not talking about functional shifting. If somebody's in HR or procurement or wherever, they're likely to continue to do those things, but they might bounce from hospitality to IT to healthcare.
Different industries within the sector.
And if I may tell one silly story, I remember the first time I got a piece of work in telecoms, which I'd never done any work on, simply down to knowing a senior sales director who I actually fired at one point as an HR person. You could get the fun jobs. And because that was done well and he knew me, he gave me the tiniest little assignment. It was literally just a few days work. And I find that once you have done a few days work, companies are remarkably willing to allow that to tick the box. So if you're willing to swap industry sector, I would suggest do something, do almost anything, even if it's really small. And that really opens up the possibilities. Any thoughts, Simon?
No, I totally agree with you. I think that's great advice. Just reading some of the other comments that we've had in the chat box.
And I've also got another one from Colin on client flexibility on IR35, which we'll need to pick up.
We've probably got another 5-10 minutes of the presentation, so if there are any other questions,
okay. Well, let me read Colin's, and then we'll pick up Stuart's and Greg's. Any views on how flexible clients will be to structure assignments so they're deemed to be outside of IR35 instead of rigidly deeming them inside IR35? This is going to depend on very much on the client, isn't it? If the client is absolutely determined that their assignments are going to be inside IR35, and I think there are certainly some bodies within the public sector particularly who, both on political and almost philosophical grounds, are averse to having outside of IR35 folk on board. Would you say, Simon?
I think it's the supply and demand. If the supply of interims is particularly if we have interims moving out of the industry and it's becoming more diminished supply and the demand is high, they're going to have to pay the rates and take the risk. Bearing in mind that I don't think employing a senior interim is a risk in terms of IR35, but that's a personal opinion.
And I think it's going to become very interesting in the spring with the private sector. If the private sector needs a job doing and the interims who are approached, do you want to do this within IR35, say, take a hike, my friend. Then if they don't want the job doing, they will structure it outside IR35, as for some assignments would be perfectly appropriate.
I think too the slight growth in the people calling themselves consultants is a way, a tactic, if you like, of avoiding the IR35 question. But then you're more advisory than you are hands-on.
Yeah.
So it's being a genuine interim, I'm very hands-on in getting things changed. So and
it also means that the traditional gap assignment where you step into somebody's shoes continues to diminish. It used to be 10 years ago, around 20% of the interim market was gap assignments, stepping into somebody who was on maternity leave or ill or not there or whatever it be. And we've seen that number coming down. I don't have it at my fingertips just this second. I think it was around 7, it was below 10%. So we keep seeing that gap assignment fall. And that's just a reflection of regulation, I reckon.
Good point from Stuart Copeland.
Okay, let's have a look at Stuart, Greg, and then Mark's point. Stuart is, have you been reading these, Simon?
I have, but feel free.
Matching headcount to demand, says Stuart. Not as keen to use external resource just now. I think that may be true, but equally, as the market gets back into gear, I could also see people not wanting to add permanent headcount to resolve issues. So they may be quite happy to resolve a situation with an interim. We saw this in 2010 at the heart of the last economic downturn. There were many businesses who were simply clenching their financial buttocks, if that's an illusion I can use, to not do anything and not spend the money, even if there was a palpable need to do something. Once it became clear that things were going to be okay, budgets were loosened up and they dealt with the back catalogue of things. And I think the same will happen this time.
Just to mention one more, if you do have any IR35 questions, do put them in chat. And if you want a detailed response from our expert, Tony Evans, on IR35, please leave your email address. And you can put it to all panelists or all panelists and attendees if it's an open question.
Greg is asking about the use of an LLP model to bypass IR35 assessment. I'm not that versed on NLP benefits, but I would say that it is such a tiny proportion of interims who are claiming LLP as a mechanism. The vast majority of interim managers still operating as limited companies.
Okay.
Perhaps we can refer the LLP point to Tony to see if he's got anything extra to add.
we'll take a copy of all the
Yeah.
text, the chat box at the end of the webinar.
Stuart then goes on to talk about businesses. No business was resilient, so that needs fixing. Many sectors will have to change their business models. Absolutely. And didn't they used to say that interim management was counter-cyclical? When times were good, you'd need less interim managers because firms had money and had more permanent headcount. And when times were bad, suddenly people want interim managers because there's loads of chaos and crisis and problems to deal with. And I think interim managers believed that was true until the 2008-10 economic downturn, when we had that situation where businesses simply stopped spending the money. So I think this time there's going to be plenty of chaos, plenty of change work, plenty of stuff that needs doing. It's going to come down to when the businesses feel safe, when they feel confident enough to come out of that spend nothing lockdown.
It's
It
also
remains to be seen when that is.
The extra skills
Yeah.
that aren't in-house to
Yes.
come on board and do something rapidly, which is what interims are renowned for doing.
Going down the screen, we have a point from Mark. Will emerging functional roles like digital director, change agent for digital transformation become more in demand than traditional roles? That's interesting. It's a bit like how under COVID, we've seen so many more people delivering things than having people go to a shop to go and get them. How more people are streaming and downloading and doing things on Zoom. You know, it's been months since I took any cash out the cash machine. I'm so much on those little. I pay with my phone now.
Or filled up my tank of fuel. Yeah.
So there are many things I think that COVID will bring as a permanent change. I'm uncertain quite how that will affect interims, other than in a general sense, and I welcome your views on that. Perhaps we should ask about it in the next survey.
By the way, we are recording this webinar. It will be available
Sadly.
for us to refer to back next year when we rejig the question and the focus. Because this year we had a new section around COVID.
Yeah, I'll pick up, if I may, a point from Debbie, who often works in gap assignments. Debbie makes the observation that what she does is very different to a permanent post holder. And I think that is true. And I think it was always true. Where it becomes interesting with an IR35 perspective, I think it's going to be how that role is labeled, how that role is explained or titled, so that the interim is still doing that quality piece of change work, even if they are temporarily occupying a space that somebody else occupied. But they may have to sell it as more of a consultancy, as more of it's a temporary fix activity, a project, something that can be sold much more acceptably against IR35, even though, frankly, that's what people always did. Fair enough?
Ralph's asked a question: do you have info on how many ISPs are still furloughing their staff, or any wider view of the current health of ISPs?
I can say that from what I can tell, and I've been watching the LinkedIn feeds fairly carefully, I haven't seen any interim service providers falling over.
I haven't been up on any either.
The people who I would normally talk to still seem to be in their firms. So even if furloughing has been taking place, the firms still appear to be there.
I agree with
you. As always, there are better firms and there are less capable firms. And one of the things we try to do each year with the provider rankings is to show the firms that interims are indicating are the ones that are doing the best.
Well, we're coming up for an hour. I think we might.
Would you mind if we just push through and make sure we've caught all the questions? Because I'd like us to go with a clean plate. So, just picking up on Stuart's point, it might be worse not to change, as your competitors will get there first. I think like anything, if you want to work as an interim, you need to be active. You need to stay on the button, and as comes from the survey, providers like to be contacted if they reach out to you within ideally half a day, within a day of a request, and clients I'm sure are the same. So I think it remains important to stay responsive to potential work. Thank you, Sharon, for some nice words. I would still recommend reading the survey yourself. There's 51 pages of stuff there, and we can't cover that in an hour.
Mark Robert has an interesting question. If a new entrant to interim, is it still best to approach an ISP by email direct, and what ways are best to avoid? I think you mean avoid rather than void, just sitting on the database. Well, my experience is you've got to get out there and meet them. As we pointed out in this presentation, it's relationships, it's the people you know, and currently it's about Zoom calls rather than meetings.
It's absolutely about relationships.
Yes.
Probably the worst way is a cold email submission to a link on a portal that goes into a database and no one talks to anybody.
You've got to be on the phone, you've got to be updating with some news perhaps every 2, 3, 4 weeks to the people that you know, the recruiters within the firms that you know, and with some insight, because they always appreciate insight as well as what you're finding.
The providers don't like to be nagged, so if it's naggy emails or naggy phone calls or why haven't you gotten me a job yet, then that's not going to go so well. I think to simply serve up on an appropriate time scale what you're up to. Here is a fresh CV link. Here's everything you need to know to place me quickly. You are selling yourself as an easily sold commodity. That works.
Great. One more coming in.
John, you know that one has fallen over. I'd love to know which one. So if it's in our rankings, we should take that into account if an ISP isn't there anymore. But thank you for those comments.
In response to Mark's follow-up, I would email and follow up with a phone.
Okay, thank you, John. That's not a provider that's in our rankings, so that wasn't one I was aware of. Where can you get a list of ISPs? The link I would recommend, and I'm actually going to paste it into the feed, is from the IIM website, which gives an annual rundown of the providers. And I'm just typing it because I can't multitask.
That's right, it's just provider.
And it's iim.org.uk/providers. And that will give you the latest, spankingly up-to-date list. And you've done it, Simon.
Always a very handy source. I direct a lot of people to the providers page.
Exactly.
I know where it is.
And I know the providers like it too.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have anything to say before we wrap it up for today?
Okay. Do bear in mind we've got another 6 webinars coming up. Please do sign up for them on the IIM website, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
And thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.